Hi VC, what's up? It's Nico back again with another episode of Albums Under the Radar. And this is a special feature on the Krautrock years. And I perhaps have shown a couple of these albums before, but I think most of these I haven't shown. But anyway, let's start, and perhaps some of you, most of you, know these albums or bands from before, but it might be a help in finding some new music as well. Let's start off with a band most of you have heard about. It's Amundul and the second album, Collapsing Singvögel, Rückwärts und Kompani from 1969, and this is a wonderful avant-garde improvisational experimental piece. Amundul, what can you say about them? They were a hippie commune, a political hippie commune, which decided to start making music. And most of these players, or musicians if you like, weren't skilled at all, which made up for some crazy sounds, very primitively recorded and performed. And the rumors say that the albums which Amundul put out were recorded in an hour-long jam session and then later released in parts as different albums, and this is the second. So if you're in that mindset for avant-garde disharmonic improvisation, this is a very cool place to start. Next up, something else, a one-album band called, if it's the band which is called Psychedelic Underground, or if it's the album, I'm not sure, but it's called Bukai Retziem. I believe that's the band name, Bukai Retziem, which is backwards for Meister Jakob, Father Jakob in Norwegian, Father Jacob in English, that famous lullaby. And this is studio musicians, as I mentioned, recording one album for the small-time budget label FAS. And this was released in 1968, so quite early on in the krautrock scene. This is a Himalaya reissue, which sounds great actually. And this is a highly recommendable album. The theme for Father Jacob goes through on this album in different variations, but there are many other songs and themes as well. Highly skilled musicians, and a wonderful psychedelic early krautrock album. Next up is a band which isn't under the radar at all perhaps, but very famous for those who know and like the krautrock genre. I'm of course talking about Brain Ticket, which actually was a Switzerland-based band with a Belgian front figure. The keyboard player was from Belgium, but they were based in Switzerland. And this is of course their famous debut album called Cottonwood Hill, which was banned in many countries because at the time the radio stations thought this was drug-fueled music, and actually some of the originals had a warning sticker that warned people from listening to this music more than once a day because it would damage people's brains. And this is quite a challenging listen. It's one of the very few records my girlfriend had told me to turn off, because it's quite annoying if you're not in the right mindset. It's quite repetitive. I think it has one track which is quite melodic and accessible, and the rest is very, very drony. But this wasn't the album I would like to feature. The album I would like to feature from Brain Ticket is the second album, called Psychonauts, which hasn't gotten the same amount of attention as Cottonwood Hill, but this is much more accessible, more song-oriented, has bits of psychedelia, avant-garde of course, and also some heavy progressiveness going on. And as a matter of fact, I favor this album, Psychonauts, to Cottonwood Hill. So that's my Brain Ticket album under the radar for you. The second from 1972, Psychonauts. Next album I think I have shown before. It's the wonderful one-off album band Knish and their self-released album from 1973, which is a wonderful blend of progressive rock, psychedelic rock, and classical elements, clearly influenced by those British progressive acts such as the Knish. But they had their own sound, and it deserves to be mentioned, and it deserves your attention. Quite competent musicians, and even though it was a privately released album from 1973, the sound production is quite good, as a matter of fact. And this is an Amber Sound Room reissue. You'd be hard pressed to find an original, but these are still available, at least online. It comes with the original insert, which those Amber Sound Room reissues usually do. So, Knish, a solid Krautrock one album band, which is a very enjoyable listen. Next up is what you heard in the introduction, and also a band I've shown before, but it's such a monster of an album, it deserves all the attention it could get. And it's Gamora's album Trauma, which actually is a reworking of their debut album from 1969, simply called Gamora. This has all the songs from the debut, but reworked with English lyrics and re-recorded. And of course the debut album from 1969 went by largely unnoticed, so they thought they'd make this English version, but commercial success and attention eluded the band, sadly, because this is a masterpiece in my mind, at least. Gamora, and this is a long hair reissue pressed on high quality vinyl, and of course with an insert, a bio of the band, pictures of the band, and the bio is written in both English and German. And if there's one album I would like, I want you to go and listen to straight away, it's this one. It's a magnificent psychedelic hard progressive piece from 1971. Very skilled musicians, great sound production, space rockish, everything you just love about the Krautrock years. Next album, next band is not under the radar at all, but the first album is quite unlike the rest of their discography, and it has been neglected by the band themselves for many years, and many of the fans of the band don't like this album, but it's my favorite, and it's of course Kraftwerk's first album, self-titled, from 1970. And this is really experimental avant-garde with early signs of electronica, A lot of analog oscillators and tone generators are being used alongside flute and conventional drum kit and Hammond organ. And this is a dark electronic masterpiece, Krautrock masterpiece in my mind. And standout tracks I would recommend you go listen to is, for example, Vom Himmel hoch, and the opening track Rückzug. Never mind. But this is entirely something else than the later Kraftwerk catalog. And it features Klaus Dinger of Neu on the drums. If you like this album, you might as well check out an album called Tone Float by a band called Organization, which is the precedor to Kraftwerk. They released one album in 1969. Well, next up we have another one album band called Mammoth. Mammoth in English, of course. They released this album in 1971 on a tiny label called Mouse Trick Track Music. This is of course a reissue on the Little Wing of Refugees, and even though they only lasted for as long as the recording sessions lasted, they came together. They reformed a couple of times and released a single as well later in the 70s. But this is a marvelous psychedelic prog rock / jazz influenced album. So quite recommendable. Mammoth. Another monster album, which I don't believe I've shown before, and I think if you are into the krautrock genre, you know this one. But if you don't, stop this video and check out 2066 and Then, and their only album from at the time called Reflections on the Future. Originals are crazy expensive, but fortunately there are reissues around, even remastered reissues, which sound better than the original actually. This is a dodgy reissue on the Ear Ass Productions label, but it sounds quite alright. This is heavy progressiveness at its finest from Germany. Released in 1972, I believe, on the United Artists label, and it's a monster and a must-have for your collection if you like krautrock. Perhaps the one which is least under the radar if you know your krautrock. Last album I would like to show is Electrip by the band Exol Caravan, and this is actually the band's second album. They were originally called Soul Caravan and released an album called Get In High in 1967, which was a soul rock album. And 2 years later they went in a more experimental direction and called them Exol Caravan. And this is sort of a soul jazz experimental album. Later they renamed themselves to Exol and released a couple of albums called Krautrock and Motherfuckers GmbH, which are far more experimental and essentials, of course, in the krautrock genre. But this is a nice place to start with Exol or Exol Caravan, if you wish. Well, I don't have too much space on my memory card, so I had to rush through these records. I hope you heard Gamora in the background, and I'll leave you with a little more Gamora. And I say bye for now, and thanks for watching.